Hello everyone, Lytro Storm here, and today I'm bringing you my first ever Breaking Bad What If. I thought I'd start with something from Season 1 and work my way down the seasons for the first few What Ifs. So for Season 1, we'll be discussing what might have happened if Emilio didn't recognize Walter in the pilot episode. Now this is a good one for me to start with because fans already wonder how Emilio saw Walter if he got caught before Walt entered the cook site and was likely stored safely in another vehicle before a civilian was let out into the open. Now, since this is a new franchise for the channel and may attract viewers who have never watched my videos before, I want to explain my kind of style of what if videos because it's not what you're used to usually. My style of what if videos is to give the most realistic turn of events within an already existing story. I won't be adding or changing any elements that aren't the initial what if change or a direct or lingering result of that change. I'm not trying to tell a brand new narrative or write the story as if I was the creator with a different idea in mind. I'll be treating the world of Breaking Bad as if it were the real world, where one event makes change and the chips fall from there. My goal isn't really to write a story, it's to find changes that bring about a good story, while still informing you of what would realistically happen. That's of course what you want to see when you ask what if this happened, right? Oh, and I'll likely skip over a lot of what remains the same with broad statements. I don't really want to recite the entire series to you guys when ideally you've already watched the show. And yeah, make sure you do that before watching this video. This video itself only really covers the events of Season 1 and 2 of Breaking Bad, but it will likely still have spoilers for Better Call Saul or later events in the series that I might refer to when informing my beliefs about Season 1 and 2. So just be wary of spoilers. Like I said, I know this is the first time this series is on the channel, so you might not be fully caught up on Breaking Bad. You might be able to watch this video if you've seen the first 2 seasons, but just be wary, there might be some spoilers for other stuff. But that long-winded intro out of the way, let's go ahead and begin the story of what if Emilio never recognized Walter. So in this version of events, Emilio will be taken into a different vehicle before Walt is ever let out of the car. Emilio will then just not see Walter since he's probably a bit more occupied trying to get the cops off of him. After that, the events of the pilot still play out the same, with Walt partnering with Jesse Pinkman to cook for the first time. Jesse gives the product over to Krazy-8, who reveals Emilio made bail before forcing Jesse to take him to the real cook. Here is where things shake up a little different from the original story. Krazy-8 offers Walter to work for him, showing a bag of money, and this time Emilio doesn't get out of the car. Seeing this as a possible success, Walt agrees, as surely cooking for a dealer directly would grant him some sort of benefit. And we know from just a few episodes later that Walter has no problem cooking for and meeting a dealer. Krazy-8 approaches, with Walt nervously stepping back, before Krazy-8 smiles and asks him if he's new to this game. Walt struggles for words, trying to act cool by keeping his answer vague, not saying yes or no. Walt doesn't reveal too much information, only answering the minor questions he's asked. Krazy asks to see the product and Walt takes it out, with the dealer loving the sight. He hands Walt the bag of cash before snatching up the product and stepping outside, showing it to Emilio, who's still in the car with Jesse. Krazy-8 asks how an artist like him ended up with a partner like Jesse, and Walt just says that the circumstances were right for it. Krazy shrugs off the answer, saying that if he brings him more product like this, he can have whoever he wants as his assistant, before signaling to Emilio to let Jesse out of the car. Emilio shoves him out the door onto the ground, and Krazy-8 says to meet him here in exactly 1 week with a new batch. He'll hook him up at the right price. Walter agrees, asking his name, and Krazy-8 of course gives his street name. He then tilts his head before leaving and says, "Be seeing you, Walter." Walt's face goes from discomfort to disturbed as Krazy-8 and Emilio drive off, leaving Jesse to run up to Walt. Now before we continue, I do want to make some things clear, as I'm sure some of you are wondering why this went down the way it did. For starters, Krazy-8 is a confirmed DEA informant, and he was the one who snitched on Captain Cook, which got Emilio arrested. It's unknown whether this was intentional, but seeing that Krazy-8 and Emilio are kind of close, we can assume it wasn't. He was likely trying to get Jesse caught, and accepted the risk that Emilio might get caught too. Jesse just happened to be lucky. Because of this, it isn't in Krazy-8's best interest to betray and kill Walter or engage him in a hostile manner. The hostility only starts after Emilio suggests he's with the DEA canonically. And even then, look at Krazy-8's expression, the way he moves, and how quick he is to put the gun down. It has nowhere near the urgency or serious nature that Emilio is giving. And given the fact he's probably trying not to blow his cover to Emilio, that makes sense. We've seen Krazy be manipulative in episode 3 by trying to get Walter to let him go, so it's no surprise he'd do that here. Now, what does this mean? Is Krazy-8 going to immediately rat out Walter to Hank? Well, no. He doesn't know there's a connection between the two yet, and this product is pretty good. Krazy-8 is an informant. He's not working directly for the DEA, so he's still gonna have his own crime ring going on. He could easily start selling it and make some good money before he has to give Walter up. but next time he's questioned by the DEA, he'll have to give some sort of scoop to remain useful. Emilio's out of jail, so just keeping them up to date on him now that they know he's a player might ease things. At least for the time being. It's not permanent. Now going back to Jesse and Walt, the latter is obviously furious and begins lashing out at Jesse for giving them his name. Jesse loudly defends himself, saying that he didn't have much choice. Emilio had a gun to him the whole time they were in the car. Their conversation here would be a mix of when Walter asked for details on Krazy-8 and when Walt found out Jesse told him stuff in canon. Walter demands to know what else he told him, and Jesse gives the tiny details like his chemistry class and how he had a son. That's it. Walter takes this in and calms down, with Jesse doing the same. He then asks Walt how much Krazy-8 gave him, which I saw 8 rolls of money in the bag. We know they were 20 since we see them in episode 2. Based on the fact Jesse sold their batch alone in canon for 8,000 or 4,000 each, I'd have to assume the rolls are the standard 500 each, making an even 4,000. This also works for later when Jesse sells their product and both he and Walt still seem shocked about 4,000 each. Anyway, Walter tells Jesse it's $4,000 and Jesse is hyped to split it. Walter agrees to, but he cautions that they need to finish the cook they agreed to do here first. They do so, and after that, they drive back home. Walter washes his half of the money, arriving home with new energy as he's seen the reward of his work. And while he didn't have to kill anyone, the presumably violent drug dealer he is now working with knows who he is and could easily find details about his family. So he'd still spend the night in the bathroom out of fear rather than trauma. And since there's no bodies at Jesse's house, I don't think he'd call Walter's home phone. Because of this, Skylar's suspicions aren't raised, and we never get this iconic scene.
My name is Skylar White, yo. My husband is Walter White, yo.
This causes a chain reaction where Skylar doesn't spill Walter is smoking, only for Marie to think it's Walt Jr. and send Hank to talk to him about it. Just a random awkward moment avoided, and it means Wendy doesn't know who Hank or Walt Jr. are. In fact, most of season 1 doesn't occur at all. Walter would just continue cooking, and Hank isn't finding the gas mask or Krazy-8's car. Because there isn't so much tension between Skylar and Walter, I don't think he'd be willing to admit that he has cancer yet. He seemed to do that to escape admitting the bigger issues he had in store. But Walt would begin coughing every now and then, and that would only begin getting worse without any treatment. So Skylar finding out is bound to occur at some point. Walter also never meets Ken Wins, since he's not paying out money for treatment. Jesse wouldn't be so paranoid since there was no trauma aside from Emilio and Krazy-8 threatening him. Jesse also never moves back into his parents' house since he's not so traumatized, and his house hasn't been disgraced. He and Walter then return to the cook site on Tuesday with the RV, ready for another deal. Krazy-8 and Emilio show up, taking the product and handing over the cash. Krazy gives Walter props, as everyone in town is clamoring to get a taste of his product. He'll likely need to bump up the amount they're producing. Walter, being quick to over-deliver, agrees to the increase and asks if their price will increase, since the product is way more popular than they thought. Jesse is a little surprised at Walt's boldness, as Emilio looks at Walt intensely, walking forward before Krazy-8 stops him. He smiles a little, saying that it can be done, but he'd better get to work. The two cousins then leave, and Jesse is worried about whether he just poked the bear, while Walter is confident. He and Jesse begin cooking, and they do so again for the next few days, but this pattern is interrupted when Walt has to go with Skylar to Gretchen and Elliot's party. Now, I'm not sure whether Elliot would make the job offer to Walter without knowing about the cancer. To me, at least, it genuinely seemed like Elliot did want Walter back in his life, but it wouldn't matter in this scenario since A, Walter was going to turn it down because of his cancer, and B, Krazy-8 and Emilio know who he is, and trying to get out of the business might be a hassle for Walt, especially after he just agreed to cook more. So Walter would respectfully turn the offer down, noting that he has some personal issues. Elliot inquires about it, but Walt says he hasn't even told his wife yet, and Elliot, not knowing the severity of it, backs off. Walt and Skylar leave the party, with Walter feeling kind of down as he feels trapped by his cancer from having a better life. I don't know if Walt would tell Skylar about the job offer since he isn't so worked up about it being a pity attempt. However, what Walter doesn't know is that secretly, Jesse has been using some of the product with his friends. This is just an obvious Jesse move, and makes sense since he isn't traumatized, paranoid, and hasn't seen any of Walter's aura, if that makes sense. He still thinks he can pretty much do whatever he wants. Jesse coming home to see the Krazy-8 situation dealt with in canon really made it seem like he gained lots of newfound respect and looked up to Walter. So it makes sense that he'd start following the "we don't use our own product" rule after those events, but here, those events never happened. And I think having broken a normal routine of cooking and not knowing what else to do, Jesse would have blown through a decent amount of their stock in a party with Skinny Pete and Combo. He wakes up the next day realizing just how much they used and starts freaking out. Luckily for him, he's got the weekend to make some more, but sadly, they're nearly out of pseudo after all the cooking they've been doing. This forces Jesse to go through some contacts, leading to him getting back in touch with Badger. But Badger asks Jesse to let him tag along, since he'll be cooking solo, and Jesse reluctantly agrees, knowing he's got a decent amount to make. It'll probably be quicker with another set of hands, and Badger's cool, right? After cooking, Jesse is disappointed at the quality and goes to throw it out, but Badger gets greedy, causing Jesse to leave him behind. He then starts cooking alone, but he just isn't able to make it as good as Walt and him together. He ultimately decides it'll have to do though, as he can't burn through the little pseudo they have left. Anyway, a week passes fully, and Walter and Jesse meet up again, with Walt noticing a little bit missing from their quota. Jesse kind of shrugs it off as spillage or something. Walter takes note and decides to just go with it, hoping Krazy-8 doesn't notice a small bit missing. Krazy-8 shows up with Emilio taking the product and handing over the money, just another standard deal. After he leaves, Walter subtly reveals that he knows Jesse took some of the product by slyly remarking that they won't be taking a risk like that again. Soon after, Krazy-8 would be questioned by Hank on if he has any knowledge of the new product going around. In this scenario, he's kind of forced to act as if he doesn't know who makes it, or even that he's the one selling it. This makes him look super fake and unreliable, with Hank letting him off this time in hopes that he can find some actual stuff about it before they meet up again. And if he can't, things might go worse for him. Seeing this, Krazy-8 drives up to Walt and Jesse's cook site alone, meeting Walter outside after they're done cooking. He steps forward as Jesse exits the RV and also sees Krazy there. He asks Walter to come with him, and Walt obliges after looking at Jesse briefly. Krazy-8 takes Walt for a drive, trying to small talk before cutting to the truth. They were short. He explains that normally he'd give him a really rough time for that, but he likes Walter, and he's pretty sure he's not to blame. Walt acknowledges what he means by this, and Krazy-8 asks him if he'd be able to cook alone. Walter is confused as to why that would be a worry, but Krazy-8 gives him a serious look. Walt makes it clear that he needs an assistant, but that doesn't seem to cut it since Krazy-8 could easily offer someone. And Walter, imagining that someone could be Emilio, he does not want to work with a guy like that. So Walt doubles down on Jesse, with Krazy-8 looking a bit disappointed before saying, "Alright, if you really need him." He then takes Walt back to the cook site before driving away. Jesse asks Walt what that was about, and Walter looks at him in anger, saying that he may have just killed them. Walt explains the missing product, how he knows it was Jesse, and how Krazy-8 now wants to have Jesse removed, but he said no. So now they both may be on that list. They leave with Jesse buying a gun that night. A few days pass with Jesse and Walt cooking and discussing what to do to handle the Krazy-8 situation. Walter would come up with the plan to use Ricin and frame it as a new recipe for Emilio and Krazy-8 to try first. But I think with Walter's consistent coughing issues and him being slightly late every now and then, Skylar would eventually call Bogdan at the car wash to make sure he's not overworking her husband. But Bogdan informs her that Walter flamboyantly quit weeks ago, and so she calls his cell phone right after he's finished cooking with Jesse. She reveals her knowledge and prompts Walt to stay wherever he is for the night. Jesse, hearing the news, offers Walt to crash at his place, especially since they might be getting hunted down. Walter agrees before going home the next day and telling Skylar the truth. Or some of it. He has cancer. This sparks the poolside dinner with Marie and Hank where Skylar cries, and Walter reveals it to everyone else. After paying the oncology bill and getting fully diagnosed, Walter tells Skylar he's going to get groceries, leaving the house. He makes a call to Jesse while driving, and the two take the RV out to the desert. But with Walter being practically locked down by Skylar due to his cancer and the rapidly declining well of pseudo, Jesse and Walter recognize the fact they're going to be short. So when Emilio and Krazy-8 show up, Walt gives up the product and Krazy-8 looks very disappointed. He asks what gives, with Emilio getting angry right off the bat, and Walter stays silent for a bit before being honest. He details their lack of pseudo, and when that excuse alone doesn't cut it, he makes the bold reveal that he just found out he has cancer. It's a lie since Walt has known for a while, but it's only affecting him now, so it makes sense. Walter accepts all blame that might come from these issues, infantilizing Jesse to absolve him from whatever punishment the two already wanted to dish out. But neither Krazy-8 nor Emilio seem fully convinced this makes up for the lack of product, so Walt gives them a sample dosage for each of them. Jesse adds that it's got a secret ingredient, asking Emilio if he remembers his signature, chili powder. They manage to work it in, and it turns out it helps. During this, Walter tries to hide that he thinks Jesse just doomed the thought of this working, but I don't think Krazy-8 thinks Walt is a threat at all, since he underestimated him in the pilot. And with Emilio and Krazy seeing Jesse act childish about a secret ingredient, they think nothing of it and pop the sample to see if it hits. They turn out to be hardly impressed, as it's not much better than the usual product. And this is where Krazy-8 makes his final decision on how to proceed. But in order to do that, he gives them half of the money and expects double the product next time. He and Emilio leave, with Emilio seeming kinda confused as he expected his cousin to punish them accordingly. Once Krazy-8's car is out of sight, Walt and Jesse celebrate, believing they have won. Sadly, Walter has to cut this short though, as he does have groceries to grab. So he drives the RV to a store, asking Jesse if he would grab his car from Jesse's house and bring it to him in order to save time. Jesse, believing Walt just saved his life, agrees and drops off Walter before taking the RV back to his house. Walt quickly grabs all the groceries he needs, arriving outside as Jesse pulls in with the car. The two load the trunk before Walt drives Jesse to his house and heads home. Once Walter makes it, Skylar is a bit curious as to why it took him a while, but she's willing to brush it off as he's going through a lot. And so, Walter feels relieved that most of his problems will be gone within the next 3 days. But what he doesn't realize is that after dropping Jesse off, he'd enter his house to see Emilio waiting for him. Jesse apologizes for everything to Emilio, trying to save himself, but Emilio beats him down, calling him a snitch, among other insults, before finally putting a bullet in him. Jesse bleeds out on the ground, with Emilio taking the keys to the RV and driving off victorious. The next day, Walter calls Jesse, leaving a few voicemails about a shopping list before they can cook again. Even with Krazy-8 and Emilio gone, there's gotta be someone out there that will buy from them, especially now that their product is huge. On that same day, Krazy-8 would be talking to Hank about his cousin, and how he hasn't seen him for a while. But he knows Emilio thinks a kid named Jesse Pinkman ratted him out, and that was the last thing he remembers them talking about. So Hank gets a warrant to search Jesse's house, finding his body and starting the hunt for Emilio Koyama. With Emilio thinking he's good, he'd be caught pretty easily and jailed while they question him. Oh yeah, and like I discussed earlier, Krazy-8 totally knew about the risk of the DEA catching Emilio when he ratted out Jesse, since they worked together, so this shouldn't be a stretch at all. Emilio hires Saul Goodman as his lawyer, who advises him not to speak while he tries to get him out of as much trouble as he can. Krazy-8 would also be questioned since he seemed to know a little more than he was letting on before, but Hank really can't get anything out of him. He's Emilio's cousin, and he's essentially been hired by the DEA to look for these kind of details, so the rest of the crew is okay with believing it was solid work on his part. But Hank knows Emilio is involved in the selling of new drugs on the street, so he tries to get him into a deal to give up the mastermind. Of course, Emilio definitely has the motive, since he likely believes Walter is also a snitch now. But before he can go in to discuss the deal, he falls dead due to the ricin in his body, and the DEA is not sure what to make of it. But it seems very suspicious, and there was likely some foul play. Meanwhile, Walter finds word of Jesse's death on the news, not believing his eyes. He then spots a familiar RV outside of his house, and terrified of his family finding out or being hurt, he goes outside and approaches. Krazy-8 coughs while aiming a gun, and tells him to get in. He then begins driving, as he explains that if he doesn't want to end up like his partner, he'd better get to cooking more. Walter recognizes the effects of the ricin and stalls for time, explaining that he'll need to get more methylamine among other supplies. Krazy-8 doesn't care about the details, he just needs it done. They're gonna start cooking tonight. As he drives, he coughs and vomits violently, before swerving, forcing Walter to seize the moment and exit the RV. At that moment, the RV is hit by an oncoming vehicle, as Walt gets to his feet and runs away. Krazy-8 lies in the RV, severely injured and breathing heavily, before his life fades due to the ricin. As Walt starts making his way home, he thinks of some alibi for Skylar to not get onto him for leaving in the middle of the night. When asked, he tells her that he went on a walk to clear his mind, and she is a bit suspicious, but once again can write it off for now. Or she would, if what Walter did next wasn't so absurd. And yeah, I think this is where the Walter assaulting Skylar scene would take place, given the trauma and absurdity he just went through. It still ends the same, and Walt sits out by the pool before Skylar confronts him. From that point, Walt accepts the treatment and shaves his head abruptly due to the trauma he's faced and the chemotherapy. With Jesse gone and Walt having no more connections into the criminal world, I really don't know if he'd be able to keep cooking. He isn't aware of Tuco, Saul, Gus, Skinny Pete, or even the guy who knew about the methylamine he and Jesse stole later on. Because of this, Walter would have to blow all of his dirty money to start his treatment, and Hank would be furious that his snitch died so randomly along with a now destroyed mobile meth lab, but he has no leads on the cook. Unless it was Krazy-8 or Emilio themselves. In fact, Heisenberg isn't even a name yet, since Walter really only worked behind the scenes for Krazy-8's business. But the need for money and the desire to have a rush would compel Walter to do some bold moves. He does some digging at the school before pulling up files on Jesse Pinkman's family and driving up to their house. But my friends, that is going to be the end of part 1 of What If Emilio Didn't Recognize Walter. It was really interesting to write a Krazy-8 that stuck around longer. He really does kind of feel like a mixture of Gus and Tuco in that he does a lot of similar things that they do. The story is already so different with Jesse dying in what basically amounts to season 1, and a lot of the events of the story kind of just being shifted to later on. But this is the first half of the story, and the second half will be covered in part 2, which will release at some point in the future. I promise not to keep you all waiting too long. But what are your guys' thoughts on this what if? Do you think the story will end positively or negatively? And what do you think Walter has planned to talk to Jesse's family about? As always, a huge shout out to our members from the Walker tier, all of which are on screen now. We also have the Survivor tier, Ellie DePlug 2, Davisville 84, Willie, Marco Caldwell, Aiden Kearns, Zombie Warlord, Tifu A, Chief Strato Constituent, and Coda Cole. And last but certainly not least, our Christian Man tier, BRL1. If you want to receive awesome perks like early video access as well as having your name read out or shown on screen at the end of the video, be sure to become a member. But as always, tell me if you liked this part, tell me what you think will happen next, comment your requests for future videos, and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.